Donald Trump abruptly and on Twitter canceled a planned state visit to Denmark, apparently because the Danish Prime Minister didn't want to talk about Greenland and selling it to the United States.
Over to Europe now, where Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has been racing across the continent, trying to shore up support from allies. That following Donald Trump's repeated threats over Greenland.
Its future on its own terms. In a turn of events few had predicted, this once overlooked Arctic island transformed into the geopolitical linchpin of the 21st century. Not because of conquest, but because of diplomacy, strategic patience, and a quiet refusal to be bullied. Greenland's political awakening had been simmering for years, but Donald Trump's aggressive second-term maneuvering unintentionally catalyzed a national response, the very act of attempting to dominate. Greenland forced the island's leaders to double down on their autonomy and their value as a sovereign partner, not a territorial trophy. By the end of summer 2025, Greenland was no longer just a dependency of Denmark. It had become a rising actor with its own foreign policy relationships, global investment partnerships, and resource leverage. Its leaders, particularly Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, were now household names across diplomatic circles. Media in Europe called him the Arctic Macron. Greenlandic youth, once disengaged from politics, began rallying around the national flag with a sense of purpose and pride unseen in generations. And as for Denmark, the kingdom's resolve had been tested, and it passed. Copenhagen was no longer just the colonial center for Greenlandic administration. It had become its chief defender and amplifier on the world stage. Danish diplomats spearheaded new Arctic forums, hosted multilateral energy summits, and negotiated further EU-Greenland investment guarantees, ensuring that Greenland's development remained multilateral and democratic. What began as a bold campaign, promised to get Greenland one way or another, ended in strategic humiliation. Rather than acquiring Greenland, Trump's administration pushed it further away. Rather than gaining mineral access, the U.S. found itself shut out of some of the world's richest emerging deposits. Rather than strengthening NATO leadership, Washington had splintered trust among some of its closest allies. In fact, by September 2025, even Republican hawks in Washington began distancing themselves from the policy. One senior GOP advisor, speaking anonymously, admitted, "The president treated Greenland like a business transaction." But geopolitics isn't a real estate deal. Meanwhile, U.S. mining and energy executives scrambled to secure new partnerships. Elsewhere in Australia, Central Asia, even Africa, a few could match the proximity, stability, and reliability Greenland offered. The loss stung, and as tensions cooled, congressional inquiries began into how the administration allowed itself to be blindsided, not by military conflict, but by diplomacy. Senate Intelligence Subcommittee convened hearings on the Arctic strategy gap, questioning whether the U.S. had grown too reliant on coercion and not enough on coalition building in contested regions. Amid the noise, one country emerged from the saga with quiet but undeniable gains. Canada, by aligning its mining sector with Greenland's resource development agenda. In doing so, through mutual respect and long-term economic vision, Canada effectively cornered a large share of future Arctic supply chains. Canadian firms became default partners for Greenland's industrialization, and Ottawa's reputation as a trustworthy northern power skyrocketed. In the words of one Greenlandic parliamentarian, the Americans brought threats. The Canadians brought contracts. Canada didn't just win economically. It gained credibility as an Arctic middle power capable of counterbalancing great power competition. The Canadian Armed Forces expanded joint training with Danish units, while Canadian research institutes opened climate and resource monitoring partnerships with Greenlandic universities. As a result, for the first time, an Arctic Council summit was proposed to be co-hosted in Nuuk in Ottawa, symbolic recognition of the new political gravity in the region. Europe, too, emerged stronger. Thanks to early legislative foresight, like the Critical Raw Materials Act, the EU had built the institutional framework to capitalize on Greenland's resource awakening. With Canada executing the fieldwork and Denmark providing political cover, Europe had secured a near monopoly on several rare earth supply chains for the next 2 decades. Brussels even launched a new trade initiative called Arctic Gateway, streamlining imports of Greenlandic minerals to EU ports while offering green transition funding in return. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hailed it as a model for sustainable strategic partnerships in a multipolar world. The irony was rich. While Trump's America had tried to forcibly own Greenland, Europe simply partnered with it and won. The Greenland saga may one day be taught in international relations classes as a textbook. Case of how power is wielded in the modern world, not with tanks or treaties, but with investment, credibility, respect. Trump's vision of 20th century-style dominance clashed with a 21st century reality, where small nations can leverage global platforms, where partnerships matter more than proclamations, and where economic diplomacy can outmaneuver even the strongest military. Greenland, long seen as a passive, icy outpost, became a bellwether for how resource-rich regions might navigate the pressures of superpower rivalry. Its people, often overlooked, rarely heard, took control of their narrative, and in doing so, they rewrote the rules of Arctic geopolitics. The Arctic, once a desolate, frozen wilderness, is no longer the untouched periphery of geopolitics. What was once ice and silence is now oil rigs and nuclear submarines, data centers and deep-sea fiber lines, surveillance posts and strategic launch pads. Following the dramatic Greenland standoff and the intensifying rivalry between the United States, China, Russia, and an increasingly assertive Nordic alliance, a tectonic shift in global power is now crystallizing across the Arctic Circle. In the wake of President Trump's failed Greenland acquisition and subsequent retaliatory sanctions by Denmark and the EU, something unexpected happened. The smaller Arctic nations, long caught between the giants, decided to stop choosing sides and instead form their own. The new Cold War, this time fought over literal cold terrain, had redrawn the world's strategic focus. As ice receded and previously unreachable resources became accessible, the Arctic opened itself to fierce competition. Russia fortified its military outposts along the northern sea route. China labeled itself a near-Arctic power, pumping billions into Iceland, Greenland, and digital infrastructure. The U.S., now under Trump's second term, reactivated naval stations in Alaska, tried to assert dominance over Greenland, demanded NATO recognition of Arctic dominance as a formal theater of war. But in the shadows of these power plays, a new coalition was forming, one that neither Washington, Moscow, or Beijing had anticipated. In April 2026, leaders from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Greenland, and Canada gathered secretly in Reykjavik, Iceland. Their mission: to forge a strategic consensus on Arctic governance without being pawns of superpower ambitions. The resulting agreement, later called the Reykjavik Accords, outlined 3 revolutionary principles. Arctic sovereignty first. No foreign military installations or mining operations without express consent of local indigenous governance bodies. Resource harmonization. Joint management of hydrocarbon and mineral exploration, with and strict ecological standards. Digital Arctic Initiative. A plan to create a decentralized, Arctic-hosted data network free from US, Chinese, or Russian surveillance capabilities. Greenland, newly autonomous, was instrumental. After resisting Trump's aggressive buying tactics, it won international admiration and became the symbolic heart of this bloc, which some began calling the Frost Alliance. Though informal, the Frost Alliance began acting with the coherence of a geopolitical power bloc. It signed mutual defense pacts with each other and invited indigenous Arctic groups to the table, backed by Scandinavian technology, Canadian logistics, and Greenland's raw resources. The alliance began positioning itself not as a militaristic counterweight, but as a technocratic and ecological third pole in global affairs. This bloc rejected both the extractive model of Russia and the infrastructure-led diplomacy of China. It refused to be a pawn in NATO's or Trump's strategic rebalancing. Instead, charted a third course: Arctically development for Arctic peoples, the focus on sustainability, digital sovereignty, In peace, when Trump learned of the Reykjavik Accords, he erupted in an unhinged tweet storm. He labeled the Frost Alliance a bunch of frozen NATO freeloaders, threatened sanctions on Arctic rare earth exports, and accused Denmark of leading a coup against U.S. interests. But this tantrum backfired. Greenland's Prime Minister, Aleka Lund, delivered a scathing rebuttal at the UN Arctic Forum. "We will not be bought, bullied, or bombed into submission. The Arctic is not for sale. It is our home." Trump's threats accelerated the formalization of the bloc. In retaliation, the Frost Alliance voted to expel U.S. companies from digital infrastructure tenders and signed a 10-year energy sharing deal with Japan and South Korea, nations looking to diversify from Gulf and Russian hydrocarbons. China, observing the growing rift between the U.S. and the Arctic states, saw an opportunity. It moved swiftly, proposing to fund Greenlandic port expansions and offered to underwrite an Arctic-wide 6G network under the guise of scientific cooperation. But the Frost Alliance saw through it. Canada and Sweden led the resistance, citing concerns over surveillance and debt entrapment. Iceland refused to host any Chinese marine research stations. Finland blocked Huawei Arctic trials outright. The first time China's Polar Silk Road ambitions met a wall, one built not of ideology, but of firm regional unity. Meanwhile, Russia watched with growing unease. The Kremlin had long relied on the Arctic as a secure flank, a reliable source of oil revenue, and a strategic bastion for its northern fleet. But now, with a cooperative Arctic bloc forming just west of its borders, one that was neither hostile nor compliant, Moscow found itself isolated. Vladimir Putin's government tried soft diplomacy, proposing a Nordic-Eurasian Arctic Concord. But after revelations of Russian espionage attempts against Norwegian undersea cables, the Frost Alliance walked away from the table. The result? A Russia further pushed eastward, increasingly reliant on Chinese financing and facing a united, assertive bloc on its northern front. By 2027, the Frost Alliance launched its most ambitious project yet, ArcticNet, a decentralized, quantum-encrypted, digital infrastructure spanning from Nunavut to Lapland, hosted in geothermal-powered data centers across Iceland and Greenland. This was more than a technical innovation. It was a geopolitical firewall. ArcticNet offered secure communications to member states, academic institutions, and even global NGOs seeking refuge from the surveillance regimes of the US, China, and Russia. Its success drew interest from Ireland, the Baltic states, and even Switzerland. It became the Arctic's version of the Internet's original vision: open, neutral, secure. Traditionally seen through the lens of oil, gas, and minerals, the Frost Alliance redefined the meaning of Arctic wealth. Freshwater reservoirs in Greenland became global strategic assets as water scarcity deepened. Rare earth elements, essential for green tech, were now traded under a new pricing and extraction code that penalized environmental degradation. Climate data gathered from ArcticNet and autonomous research drones became a form of soft power with the Frost Alliance, licensing data to institutions and governments globally. Instead of just extracting resources, the bloc began exporting knowledge, data, and ethics in response to the growing legitimacy of the Frost Alliance. The Arctic Council, long a ceremonial body, was reborn in 2028 as a legislative forum, granting binding powers on regional security, trade, and environmental standards. Notably, the United States was denied observer status until it complied with new Arctic transparency requirements. China's bid to join was flatly rejected. Meanwhile, indigenous leaders were given voting rights for the first time. The Sami Parliament of Norway, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Aleutian delegates shaped debates on shipping lanes, climate, remediation, cultural protections. A new governance model had emerged, one that merged state sovereignty with indigenous leadership and technocratic policy frameworks. By 2029, the Arctic was no longer a void to be claimed. It was a sovereign region with its own rules, its own alliances, its own leverage. The US had to renegotiate energy access under Frost Alliance terms. China had pivoted southward, turning toward Antarctic ambitions after its Arctic push was rebuffed. Russia, facing stagnating oil revenues and naval overextension, began secret back-channel diplomacy with Norway and Canada and the Frost Alliance. It was quietly reshaping the global order with its green tech exports, data sovereignty, freshwater reserves, and ecological leadership. It had carved out a fourth pillar of global influence alongside the US, China, and the EU. But perhaps most importantly, it had created something no superpower could buy: a vision of regional unity based not on fear or dominance, but on cooperation, sustainability, sovereignty. In a world consumed by great power competition, the Arctic dared to write a different story. A story where smaller nations stood up, not to fight, but to lead. The Frost Alliance is not just a bloc. It is a blueprint. For the future, the Arctic winds have always whispered secrets of oil, of strategy, of old empires waning and new ones emerging. But now, in the final chapter of Donald Trump's Arctic ambition, those whispers have become roars. As the planet shifts and the world watches, Trump's final gambit comes into view. A high-stakes reckoning in the coldest theater of geopolitics. This is not just about Greenland anymore. It's about legacy. It's about leverage. And for Donald Trump, it's about reasserting control over a world order that has rapidly moved beyond him. It begins in 2029, a full year after reclaiming the presidency under the banner of America. Resurgent Donald Trump summons his National Security Council to Camp David. Not to talk about China, not to talk about Ukraine, but to talk about ice and the dominance of it. His plan is bold, risky, unprecedented: to use the newly formed Arctic Free Alliance, a bloc of energy giants, private equity firms, and friendly Nordic breakaway states to outmaneuver NATO and the UN in carving out economic sovereignty in the North Pole. The room falls silent. Even the hawks like Pompeo's successor hesitate. But Trump pounds the table. If we don't take it, they will. And I'm not letting China or Starmer get their hands on what should be ours. Thus begins the operation unofficially dubbed Operation Polaris. At the UN Climate Congress in Geneva, Keir Starmer, by now clinging to power in the UK through a fragile coalition with the Greens and Scottish nationalists, warns of unilateral American aggression in the Arctic. This isn't the 20th century. This is a shared, not Trump's frozen playground. China, meanwhile, doubles down on its Arctic Belt initiative, expanding deep-sea ports in Siberia and militarizing shipping lanes along the northern sea route. With stealth drones and ice-hardened destroyers, then comes the Scandinavian wildcard. Norway and Sweden, long neutral, begin secret negotiations with Trump's team, driven by fear of Russian expansionism and EU's green mandates strangling their fossil economies. The resulting alliance, dubbed the Northbourne Pact, stuns the globe. This new bloc agrees to joint exploration rights with U.S. companies across vast swaths of unclaimed Arctic shelf. Trump's bet begins to pay off, but the consequences are immediate. Reykjavik becomes the epicenter of global fury. In an emergency NATO session, Canadian PM Mark Lafleur accuses the U.S. of economic annexation. Angela Baerbock, now EU High Representative, declares, "Trump is exploiting climate collapse to fuel imperial resurgence. We will not allow a second Cold War over melting ice." Trump responds on X, formerly Twitter, "Let them melt. We'll build. They'll beg. Watch." The European Parliament freezes all Arctic infrastructure contracts with U.S. firms. Protests erupt from Oslo to Ottawa. Greenpeace declares a climate insurgency, blockading U.S. icebreakers in Barents waters. One activist vessel is sunk. No lives lost, but outrage explodes. Trump, unfazed, holds a rally in Anchorage. "We're bringing the jobs back. We're drilling for freedom. The rest of the world can go freeze. We'll be warm and rich." As physical clashes simmer, the digital front explodes. Anonymous and a host of Nordic cyber militants begin targeting the Northbourne Pact. Trump Tower's servers are taken offline. Raytheon's Arctic R&D labs are hit with malware traced to Finnish hacktivist networks. In response, the U.S. Cyber Command, now restructured under Trump loyalist General Mark Krieger, launches Operation Frostbite. Arctic satellites controlling weather and shipping intel are scrambled. China accuses the U.S. of manipulating climate surveillance data. Sweden retaliates with a full blackout of Arctic GPS to U.S. firms. The Arctic becomes a zone not just of military tension, but information anarchy. No one trusts the data. No one knows the ice thickness. Shipping lanes vanish into algorithmic fog. It's the first climate fog war in history. It's 100% digital. In Greenland's capital of Nuuk, a nationalist uprising explodes. The Danish-appointed governor is ousted by a populist movement backed by Northborn influencers and far-right. Militias trained in Alaska, they declare the Republic of Kalatanunat free from Copenhagen and open to full privatized US investment. Trump immediately recognizes the new state. Greenland is free. No more socialist ice chains. America stands with them. Denmark cuts diplomatic ties. The EU imposes sanctions. Russia moves troops into Franz Josef Land, triggering a flash standoff with Norwegian F-35s. For Trump, it's a masterstroke. He installs Exxon-backed administrators in Nuuk. Oil flows begin, not massive, but symbolic. American flags flutter in the Arctic Circle, but the world isn't just watching anymore. They're preparing to hit back. At the G20 Emergency Summit in Cape Town, Fisher's Deep in. India refuses to condemn Trump, citing its own polar ambitions. Saudi Arabia offers joint Arctic capital investment. Even Brazil, under a right populist resurgence, considers joining. The Northborn Pact as a tropical observer. The Arctic, once a marginal zone of interest, is now the pivot point of a complete realignment in global geopolitics. The United Nations tries to enforce a moratorium on Arctic development, citing indigenous rights and planetary climate thresholds. Trump responds with one word on X: irrelevant. Then comes the blowback, not political but planetary, in early 2030. A catastrophic glacial shelf collapse sends sea levels spiking across the North Atlantic. Boston floods, Aberdeen disappears. Beneath tidal surges, Miami's new seawall cracks. Environmental. Scientists directly blame the Northborn extraction projects for destabilizing already fragile formations. The media explodes. Former allies in Norway call for withdrawal. Protesters in Seattle torch Arctic drilling offices. Even in Texas, where the oil flows, the storms grow too strong to ignore. Trump is cornered. His own party begins to fracture. Nikki Haley leads a centrist revolt, claiming, "We gained the Arctic, but may have lost the Earth." But Trump doesn't retreat. He doubles down. From a new presidential installation in Barrow, Alaska, Donald Trump addresses the nation and the world. Flanked by military brass and oil CEOs, he declares, "This is America's new frontier. We will not be bullied. The ice may melt, but our resolve won't. The Arctic is ours to lead, and we will lead it on our terms." It's a historic moment, defiant, surreal, almost imperial. But the world sees a man isolated in white desolation, clinging to a vision that risks consuming the very future it aims to dominate. Then, something unexpected. China and the EU jointly announced the Global Arctic Convention, a treaty to freeze all new Arctic exploration and enforce immediate carbon sanctions on all violators. More surprising still, Canada signs. So does the UK, under a post-Starmer coalition. Even some US states threaten lawsuits over ecological damage. The walls close in. Trump faces what could be the greatest challenge of his political life: abandon the Arctic dream or risk global economic and diplomatic isolation. And yet, whispers swirl that he has one final card. It's not oil. It's not ice. It's data. Behind the scenes, Elon Musk's Polar-Link satellite constellation, funded in part by Trump-friendly super PACs, has mapped untapped resources. New shipping corridors, and possibly even rare earth mineral veins, deep under Greenland's permafrost. Some believe Trump intends to declare the Arctic an economic data zone where AI-driven trade routes, currency-free exchanges, and crypto-based energy credits can flourish beyond the grip of traditional regulators. If they don't want us drilling, we'll outthink them. Arctic 2.0 begins now. New kind of frontier capitalism, rooted not in oil but information, as ice melts and nations drift. One thing becomes clear. Donald Trump has not just redrawn the map of the Arctic, he's redrawn the idea of power itself. In the coldest place on Earth, the fires of ambition now burn brightest. And as the world prepares for what comes next, we are left with a chilling truth. The final gambit has been played, the reckoning has just begun. And so, as ice melts and alliances harden, the Arctic becomes more than a frontier. It becomes the fulcrum of a new world order. For Donald Trump, this is no longer just about Greenland. It's about legacy, dominance, and survival. But in the shadows of rising superpowers and unraveling diplomacy, one thing is certain. The final gambit is only just beginning.